Welcome to the Zveda podcast. I'm Jamie.
And I'm Lorena.
We're a community for women by women. We're here to help each other rise to impact generations. Hi, ladies. Happy New Year. This is our first podcast that we're recording in the new year. So we're really excited to be here, to be back.
Yes.
And to just starting up some conversation to launch us into the new year. And yeah, just super excited.
Yeah, we're super excited. Thank goodness it's 2021. 2020 is behind us. And yeah, we're just excited to roll out some fresh content for y'all this year. So without further ado, the trending topic that we want to talk about today is actually something that came up in a conversation with one of my friends recently. We were just chatting about leadership, and one of the quotes that she said that she's heard recently by Craig Groeschel is that this idea that trust is given, whereas mistrust is earned, which kind of puts that statement of, trust being earned on its head. And the example being, we were talking about how there's a lot of big life decisions that we'll make, whether it's, wanting to go to college, or, wanting to get married, wanting to buy a house, these bigger life decisions, and that we'll encounter in our lives. And she said a lot of times as women, or even men as well, like we'll be maybe afraid to accept that responsibility, especially when working with like different bosses and senior managers, maybe in a full-time job position, kind of afraid to be like, oh, I don't know if I have what it takes. And think in this statement that trust is given and mistrust is earned, can go a long way with these big life decisions that, just trust yourself. Like it's already a gift. It's something that you can extend for yourself to step out on instead of thinking like, oh, I've got to earn trust. I have to prove myself first before I can dive into, a big decision that requires me to rise up and take responsibility over something. It's just a pretty interesting thought, that, kind of got me just thinking about different things. Yeah. So I don't know, Jamie, what do you have kind of related to that? Any thoughts or conversations recently with any friends of yours?
Well, not really. So not really on trust.
Okay.
But when I read that you had put this in here for today, I was like, my mind was going a different direction. So it was interesting to hear that even like trusting yourself.
Yeah.
That mistrust, like, well, what have we done to mistrust ourselves?
Maybe failing or what we would define as failing in a previous life experience. Maybe there's that fear to take a step out and try something new, or if we've just never done something before and we don't know if we'll be successful. We don't have that like historical knowledge or experience to build that, confidence, that's naturally built in. But yeah, it's an interesting way to see it as like trusting yourself to take that step.
Right. It is. It's cool.
Yeah.
I don't really have any big comments to add because I'm really pondering now because I was going a whole different direction with the whole trust process.
What were you thinking, like specifically with other people? Like if trust is where, say, for example, like you're working in a job where maybe you're working with somebody who's in their 50s or 60s from just a different generation. And there's that mindset of like, well, trust needs to be earned, Right. I've heard of that before. Have you experienced that in your work?
Oh, for sure. And that's, I think, where my mind is like spinning right now because that's what you always hear, know, and it's really interesting because one of the, I'm taking an online class right now, hosted by Jackie Dorman, and she wrote the book, The Heart Work. And it's just fantastic about really seeking heart healing in some key areas. And I know we're going to be digging into that some today, but her statement is, no, you have to trust first.
Yeah.
Because, if we hold back, we're not really being who we really are. So the other person, like in a dating relationship, let's say, like if you're like, well, I'm not going to trust you at all until you prove to me that you can. She flips it on its head too. And like, well, actually, no, you should really trust them until they give you reason not to. And that opens a whole part of, another part of relationship and conversation. But one of the things that she talked about this week that I thought was really interesting is that we view other people, and I think we've talked about this before, but through the lens that we have in our own experiences.
Absolutely.
And oftentimes we expect other people to act like us. And so when they do break our trust, we're really devastated and we can't forgive them. And we go, there's a lot of things that come out of that, but just that whole concept of, it's all born with this lens that we have on. So how do we trust?
Yeah.
What are the ways that we trust others? What are the ways that we mistrust others? And maybe there's just something there that we could dig into and look at for ourselves. That's something we need to overcome. And it might just allow us to have more grace for people in situations. But
yeah, I think with the mistrust piece, a lot of times I think it's due to maybe a hurtful or negative experience in the past that kind of, like you're saying, it creates that lens that then we relate to new experiences from our grid that's been formed. And we have a really cool activation that we're going to talk about towards the end of this podcast that can help some of that reworking of that grid or that lens. So I think that'll be a good nugget that we'll be able to give later on in the episode today.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So on that note, we want to just jump into the main content. So from episode 9, if y'all journey back with us, maybe about 5 or 6 episodes from here, we described our second core value, which is we believe in the confidence of being. And we've kind of been breaking that down into episodes 13 and 14, and then today episode 15, where we want to dive into the kind of like emotional, healthy side of that. You've got many other components that build into being a healthy woman. And today we want to really talk about the parts of the soul. I've heard this in a lot of different teachings from many different people. And it's just an interesting way to think about it. It's maybe not like the ultimatum truth, but to think about the soul in 3 parts, being your mind, your will, and your emotions. We're going to talk more about each of those, but emotions are your feelings and the ability to respond to experiences in the world around us. Whereas your mind, obviously, as we know, that's our thinking faculty. That's our ability to reason, to judge, to, make decisions, from the stimuli that we're getting, and maybe, being in tune with the emotional response as well, taking that in as additional stimuli. And then our will is the ability to choose. A little side note here that'll blow y'all's minds a little bit, but I remember one of my friends told me at one point, he was like, Lorena, like the most powerful thing on this earth is the human will, because it's the only thing that God does not compromise. And I was like, wow, like we have a powerful just decision-making ability inside of us that, that there's reasons many different situations happen in life, in our experience, because of the power of the will that each of us have inside of us to make decisions. So we kind of want to break down each of those. But one of the scriptures that stands out to me about the soul is from 3 John chapter 1, verse 2. It says, Beloved, I pray that you would prosper in all things and be in health, just as your soul prospers. And I think it's really important to value our soul, and another kind of term in Christian language would be your heart, right? Like your heart, your soul, that's all kind of the same kind of part of you. You have your spirit, your soul, and your body, the soul being your mind, will, and emotions. But God really values us being aware of what's going on in our soul. What are we feeling? What are we thinking? And as a result, what are our decisions being made with those inputs? So we want to kind of break that down a little bit. So emotions, a couple really cool things that I've learned recently that has brought a lot of life to me in navigating my just whole emotional kind of runway and developing language to express my emotions. One of the things is that when you experience an external stimuli coming towards you, you're perceiving it and you have an emotional response, there are actually chemicals that are released from your brain that surge throughout your body. And, whether it's a positive leaning emotion or more of a negative one, like, maybe anger or fear or sadness, we feel that rush. We feel that emotion in our bodies at a physiological level. And typically the release of those chemicals can last anywhere from 60 to 90 seconds. So a minute to a minute and a half. That's quite some time for that to go. So I wanted to note that with your feelings or with your emotions, it's really important to allow yourself to feel and to recognize those, knowing that emotions, they will come and they will go, kind of like waves, you think about like going to the beach and walking along the shore, you've got waves coming in and out. That's kind of like feelings of emotions. When you experience something, the feeling will come and it will go. It will pass. It's not going to be something permanent, that's ongoing. Yeah. And then two, another piece that I wanted to identify here is that, it's important to separate how you're feeling or an emotional response from your identity. So, for example, there might be a situation where you feel guilty as a response to it. That's very different than associating that with your personhood and like identifying yourself in shame. Like those are two very different things. And so just, as we're talking about emotions, it's just important to realize that emotions, they come and they go, and it's healthy to feel them in the entire spectrum, positive and negative leaning ones.
All right, that's really good. I've heard it said that in terms of not making it part of your identity, the statements that we make are, I'm angry, or I am fill in the blank.
Instead of I feel.
And it's like, stop, watch the language that we use to describe our emotions, because we don't want that settling in. We can feel angry or be angry at a situation, but when you start saying like, I am this, that's taking that on to where it can really sit for, some people a very long time, a lifetime.
Yeah.
So that's just, that came to mind when you said, be sure not to attach that to our identities.
Yeah, that's really powerful. And I think too, along that line of when we are, and this is where we'll get into the mind a little bit as well, but when we're reflecting on and consciously aware of the emotions that we're feeling, it's also really key to be honed in on what is the self-talk that is happening around those emotions that are contextualizing the situation. So if you're, having negative self-talk and like judging yourself, like, oh, like I'm feeling so frustrated by blah, 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 blah. And I'm just, negative self-talk, like, well, I shouldn't feel this way, or I could do this, differently, even if it's something outside of your control. I think some of that negative self-talk and like harboring that judgment on yourself for feeling the negative emotions instead of just like recognizing like, hey, like I feel this way. And
it's there.
Yeah. And the situation, there's pieces outside of my control, and then there are some within my control, and just taking time to kind of to suss that out a little bit. That's something I've really been growing in and learning, is not, or let's say, to be in tune with the self-talk that is happening in my mind when I'm feeling the emotion. Because if I'm harboring like all this negativity on myself and judging myself, I'm not going to want to let myself feel those negative emotions when it's really healthy to do so.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah. So speaking of, our minds, we talked about our emotions, now kind of moving to the second part of the soul, our minds. Again, contextualizing the stimuli that's coming in, our ability to reason, to judge, to make decisions, and with our will. Something that I've learned recently, as we mentioned with emotions, you feel the emotional response in your body for 60 to 90 seconds. So I know for me, sometimes I, wrestle with like a negative thought, that I have. I have it. And then I sometimes think, that kind of the self-criticizing, self-judgment kind of thoughts around that. And then it just like opens up this down spiral of all these negative thoughts. And something I've learned is that every time I feel a thought or I think a thought that, causes emotions of fear or of frustration or even of sadness, it's like every time you have that thought, boom, another rush of those chemicals being surged through your body. And to me, it really made sense of like, wow, like whenever I just allow those thoughts to go crazy, it's like a down spiral. And I'm like an hour later, I'm like, why do I feel so like hit by truck number one? Yeah. And out of control. And I think that really, for me to see what's happening at a physiological level, I saw how important it is to take captive every thought, as we know, and make it obedient to Christ, or to look at, okay, here's the situation, what's going on inside of my control, what's happening outside of my control, and then assessing, okay, I feel this way. It's okay to feel that. And then how am I going to move forward from there instead of just allowing the negative thoughts to just snowball?
Right. Yeah, I think Joyce Meyer, she has a book all about the battlefield of the mind.
Yes, it's a great book. If you haven't read it.
Teachings, you can YouTube teachings, and she has a podcast. But battlefield of the mind it's a constant battlefield. We have to take control over our minds.
Yeah.
We can't just let them flow freely all of the time, because it can land us in some very difficult, harmful situations. Especially with negative self-talk. And I think, one example that she gives in one of her teachings is, you'll just be on a walk and all of a sudden a negative, like a thought comes in and you haven't maybe thought of a situation in forever. And all of a sudden this thought comes in your head. And you're like, why am I? And then you start feeling the emotions, and here you go. Your body's feeding that. And then all of a sudden she's like, wait, no, I don't want to think about that. I've already dealt with that. I've already put that in its proper place. So that's just a reminder that when those things, it's going to happen. It will 100% happen, that a memory will come up, or a situation that you thought you've already dealt with is going to come back up. And that's obviously one way the enemy likes to play with us.
Oh, for sure.
To have you spiral into that place for the whole day. Well, instead, just realize I don't have to think about that.
Yeah.
I really don't. I can literally take that thought captive and say, no, you know what? I've dealt with it. This is how I've dealt with it. Even if you have to tell yourself out loud, I've found that sometimes, like, no, Jamie, we're not going there today. We've dealt with that, and you've gotten over that situation, and you need to just let that go. Let it go back to where it belongs.
Yeah.
So yeah. And I think, one of the things that came to mind as, Lorena, you were talking, is like going that step further and asking God, like, okay, I'm feeling this.
Yep.
I'm thinking this. Why?
So bringing him into the experience.
Yes. Like, is there something is there something I haven't dealt with yet?
Yeah. Like a deeper layer.
Yeah. Like not ignoring it,
Mm-hmm.
or maybe there's like some wisdom that needs to be gleaned from that, where you could call a trusted friend and say, you know what, this keeps coming up in my mind. Mm-hmm. Can I talk it out with you? And maybe they can help guide you in the reality of the situation versus the emotional aspect of the situation. But I think a lot of times we negate the fact that, or we think that God is just so big and so far away, when he's just ready to be that counselor for us. He's the ultimate counselor, and just spend a bit of time with him and say, look, this is how I'm feeling. I'm mad about this situation, or I feel mad about this situation.
Yeah.
This thought keeps coming up. Why is that? And write it down, like, well, Jamie, you're feeling this way because of this, and let yourself process that situation. And it gives you some power over that emotion, power over that particular thought.
Yeah, I think it's good too. It reminds me of a teaching that that a lady named Larissa from Upper Room gave probably about 1.5 years ago. It was so good, where she just talked about like us being real before the Lord, having unedited conversation with God, like stripping off all the religiosity, all the Christianese, and just going to the Lord and being like, Lord, like, here's this situation. Here's how I'm feeling about it. Now, what do you think? What are your thoughts about this? And yeah, I mean, just invite, like Jamie, like you're saying, just inviting him into the conversation. He can give that, perspective from heaven's view, as well as highlighting different people to speak into the situation from a 30,000 foot view and not the swirl of the storm.
Right.
So
yeah,
it's so key.
I think so. And just realizing that, we often just have this thought that, well, I don't have any control over my thoughts. They just come and they come. It's just like an earthquake. It just hits and it's whatever my mind wants to throw me. No, we do have control over what we think. And I know that there's some situations where, personally, that something will come to mind or a person will come to mind and I'll create this whole scene like a movie.
Like an alternate reality, right?
Yes. Yeah. And before I know it, I've spent an hour thinking about something that really just deserved about 5 minutes.
Or a situation that may not even happen.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. I've done that so many times.
So I think it's important. Like, take captive just means take control.
Yeah.
Like, we
take authority.
We do have control over the thoughts that we want to continue to ruminate on and the ones that need to be put aside.
Yeah, it's so true. And I think, on that note, it's a great segue into this, third component of our soul, right? We've got our emotions, we've got our mind, and we have our will. That is your decision maker inside of your being. Let your will rise up and take authority over the, way that you're perceiving a situation, the way that you're thinking about it and contextualizing the story about the experience. And your will be that powerful decision-making tool of knowing, okay, I'm not just going to react to this. I'm going to respond to this situation. I'm going to take some time to really reflect on it and think through, okay, this is what I want to decide moving forward. I think that's just key. There's a difference between, like I said, reacting to an experience just out of emotion and not taking time to think through it or engage your will versus responding. I know for me, I remember there was one situation, I think in my first year working at the current job that I have right now, where I made a mistake and got called into the current VP of client services office. And she was like, hey, you forgot to add me to this calendar invite. And it was a really important meeting that I needed to be in on for the rest of the team to hear my input. I felt hurt by that. And my initial response was, fear, sadness, and I just wanted to start crying. And I just excused myself to, go to the bathroom and
get yourself together.
Yeah, to cry, and get myself together. And then to think, okay, like Lorena, what are your options to respond here, and also empathize with what she's feeling as well, because how she's communicating to you is from her heart being hurt. And so I just took, a couple of minutes before I went back into her office to, going in, having processed that and thinking through, okay, this is how I want to respond. And she thanked me for, just owning the mistake that I made and asking her, okay, what can I do to make this right moving forward? So I think that's a great example of I still felt my emotion. I allowed myself to respond, to react to it, with just me. But then I also took the time to respond and create a step forward, not just for me, but for my coworker.
That's really good. One of the things that I'm going to use a lot of examples from Jackie Dorman just because
it's top of mind.
It's top of mind. It's relevant for me right now. But one of the things that she shares is that when we go through, we don't recognize some situations as actual trauma.
Okay.
In our lives.
What do you mean by that?
So for example, boss calls me in and I get reamed out. Well, that's a traumatic event.
Because it engages that fight or flight response, right?
It engages your fight or flight. It gets your emotions up. You're reacting out of that. You've let someone down. So you depending on how bad it was, say you get cussed out.
Yeah, it's intense.
And it goes on for an hour and you can't get out of there. And that's a big deal.
Yeah.
And often we just sort of push those things aside, but what she shares is that when we go through events like that, whether it's work related or, a friendship or a family or some event that's happened in our lives, it creates versions of ourselves.
Okay.
So we begin to think and see things out of that example. So anytime, so that one example happens with my boss, I get called in, I'm cussed out for an hour. It's very emotional. I leave feeling torn down. I'm less than, and then say I move on in a few years and I go to a different company and I'm sitting and I get called in to my boss's office because they just want to talk to me about
something you're doing well,
something I'm doing well, but it's the whole act of I'm scheduling a meeting. I'm calling you into my office. Well, because we've been through that event, that traumatic event, we've sort of created a version of ourselves out of that and our response mechanisms. So before we even walk into the room to even know what's going to be said, we're already afraid. We might be sweating, defensive. We might be already emotional, short of breath. Like our whole body takes on this response based on that thing happening in the past that we never really dealt with or worked through.
Yep.
And so really being able to identify those, all that to say, when something like this comes up for our emotions, in our thinking, in our mind, think back of why would I be feeling this way? I mean, we always talk about on Zveda, asking yourself more questions.
Digging deeper, yes.
Dig a little deeper. Don't just take it at face value. Like, okay, I'm really, really having a response here. Why? Why would I be having this type of response to this situation and then, just reacting to my boss calling me in or you're sending me a message and I have this like panic moment because it's based on that prior experience that I never really dealt with.
Yeah.
And that then can give your will the power to like, hey, I'm going to make a decision here that I'm going to work on whatever that is and get healing from that. Like,
it's good. So
that the next time I can release that, I'm not walking into my boss's office every single day that she calls me in thinking I'm in trouble. And that's just one small example. So
that's a good example too, because I think you made a really good point here, Jamie, and I want to reemphasize that is taking the time to get healing from that experience, because then once you have that healing, you've got that testimony.
Yeah.
So when you are faced with, let's say a situation, 2 or 3, 4, 5 years from now, where it seems like it's going to be a similar one, you can remember with your mind and then with your will, when you respond, I've already gotten healing from that. Even if your body feels that same way, like the response and the stimuli, you can remember the healing and the testimony that you've already fought for and received.
Right.
So that's powerful, because then it enables you to show up totally different when you walk into that situation.
Absolutely. Thanks for listening to the Zveda podcast. Keep your questions coming so we can rise together. Visit Zveda.com to talk to us and join our community. That's Zveda.com. We'll see you next week.